exciting and impressive enough. Still, Winston couldn't help adding a touch of flash and dash here and there, according to John Perry, a historian, in his book, Winston Churchill. Not only was Winston Churchill one of the prime ministers of England who led Europe through World War II, he was also a writer, mainly of history. His writings are important not only because they helped to support his family and were his main source of income throughout his life, but they also helped to launch and to sustain his political career. Today I'm going to tell you about some of the writings of Winston Churchill. First, we'll look at some personal and family histories he wrote. Second, some narratives of world history. And last, we'll see the Nobel Prize that he was awarded for his writings. So to start, let's look at the personal and family histories that Winston Churchill wrote. Winston Churchill was a war correspondent during Europe's wars before World War I in India, Sudan, and South Africa. Churchill wrote newspaper articles that journalized his experiences during the war. They were published back in Europe as articles. There was a lot of self-promotion in these articles that helped to launch his political career. Churchill discovered that there was an American novelist who had the exact same name as he did, and he was getting mixed up with him. In order to rectify the situation, he contacted him, and the American novelist replied, "Mr. Winston Churchill appreciates the courtesy of Mr. Winston Churchill in adopting the name Winston Spencer Churchill in his books and articles, etc. Mr. Winston Churchill hastens to add that had he possessed any other name, he would most certainly have adopted one of them." Churchill also wrote some family histories. The first one he published was on his ancestor, John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. Churchill saw many similarities between himself and his ancestor and wrote a history about it. Roy Jenkins, the British politician, in his book Churchill, notes that they were of comparable social status, but neither of them had any money. Churchill also wrote about his father, Lord Randolph Churchill. It was a 2-volume work that was published the year that his father passed away in 1906. Churchill glossed over the rougher patches aspects of his father's character and made him seem like a better person than he actually was. Teddy Roosevelt, the President of the United States, who knew Lord Randolph personally, recognized this and reviewed the book as a clever, tactful, and rather cheap and vulgar life of that clever, tactful, and rather cheap and vulgar egotist. Now that we've seen the personal and family histories that Churchill wrote, we're going to look at some narratives of world history. I'm going to tell you about 3 of the major ones. The first, a history of the English-speaking peoples. This was the British histories from 55 BC through the start of the First World War in 1914. Churchill drew on his journalism years when he was a war correspondent to write these books, although they are a history of the English-speaking peoples is different from the articles that were published from his time as a war correspondent. The second narrative I'd like to share with you is A World in Crisis. This work was World War I through Churchill's eyes, meaning that Churchill did a lot of self-promotion and painted himself as a central participant in every single event that he depicted in them, meaning he influenced people by his writings. Max Beaumont, a historian, in his book Balfour, quotes Arthur Balfour, who was a contemporary of Churchill, as saying that The World in Crisis was Winston Churchill's brilliant autobiography, disguised as a history of the universe. The last narrative I'd like to share with you is the Second World War. This, of course, covered the Second World War, from the end of World War I through the end of the Second World War. Churchill planned to write this from 1939, even before the war had started, and he kept journals and notes in order to write the volumes. It wasn't published until around 3 years after the war ended, and Churchill tried not to be too judgmental in these works, but he still wished to influence people and put his opinion out there. And he said of the works, "I will leave judgments on this matter to history, but I will be one of the historians." Around this time, there was a small discontentment over the fact that Churchill was a political not an academic one. So he had access to diplomatic, military, and cabinet records that academic historians do not have access to, which they felt to be unjust and not ethical. David Reynolds, a historian, in his book In Command of History, noted that the cabinet secretary, Sir Norman Brooks, helped Churchill to look over his manuscripts and to make sure there's nothing in them that would embarrass the European government, and even rewrote some of the passages himself. And so Churchill's history became a semi-official one. Now let's look at the Nobel Prize that Churchill was awarded for his writings. The Swedish Academy, which delivers or awards the Nobel Prizes, considered Churchill over a long period of time. They had 2 reviews done on him. The first done in 1946 by the secretary of the Swedish Academy, Per Hallström, was not a very favorable one. Still, they did not dismiss Churchill and had a second review done on him in 1948 by the history professor of the Swedish Academy. Professor L. Hund said in his review, "No man has better known how to awaken such an echo by his eloquence to reach so vast a public. It is then basically for his oratory that Churchill deserves the prize. But his art as an orator is well framed by the rest of his production." Still, with such a glowing review, Churchill was not awarded the award for another 5 years. In 1953, according to the article Winston Churchill Facts from the website www.nobelprize.org, last accessed on the 5th of October 2014, the reason that Churchill was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature was for his mastery of historical and biographical description, as well as for brilliant oratory in defending exalted human values. Churchill was deeply honored by the award, and being an 80-year-old man with failing health, requested that there be no press conference, but that he would still attend the traditional dinner with the king. Unfortunately, he was not able to do this either, as he was called away by President Eisenhower of the United States to an international conference to discuss the defense of England after the war. And so his wife, Lady Clementine, accepted the award on his behalf, reading out loud a speech that Churchill had prepared beforehand, which was met by deep silence and then followed by thundering applause. So in conclusion, today we saw some personal and family histories that Churchill wrote as a war correspondent, a loving son, and a curious descendant. We also saw some narratives of world history he wrote, which he used to influence public opinion on the events and himself. And then we saw the Nobel Prize he was awarded for his writings and his art as an orator. And we saw that not only did Churchill make history,